When the grids went dark and fuel became a ration privilege rather than a convenience, wartime survival was not decided by heroics or luck. It was decided in kitchens, cellars and courtyards by people who had to stretch scraps into meals without burning precious fuel. Across Europe and parts of Asia during the Second World War, civilians faced rolling blackouts, coal shortages, confiscated firewood, and supply chains that collapsed overnight. In that environment, a humble, nearly forgotten tool kept families fed when stoves could barely be lit. It did not rely on electricity, it did not require constant fuel, and it turned one brief burst of heat into hours of safe cooking. The haybox cooker was not a luxury, but a wartime necessity. The tool was known by many names: the haybox cooker, the retained heat cooker, the thermal box. Its principle was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Food was brought briefly to a boil, using whatever heat source was available, whether a small coal fire, a single log, or a shared neighbourhood stove. Once hot, the pot was sealed and buried inside an insulated box packed with hay, straw, wool, sawdust, or folded clothing. The insulation trapped heat so efficiently that food continued cooking for hours without additional fuel. During the Second World War, this allowed families to cook stews, grains, legumes, soups, and bread puddings while using a fraction of the fuel normally required. Why retained heat mattered more than firepower in civilian survival. Fuel scarcity was often more dangerous than food scarcity. Rations could be stretched, fuel could not. Coal deliveries were sporadic, firewood was confiscated or forbidden, and electric cookers were useless during outages. The haybox cooker solved the fuel problem first, which automatically solved the food problem. Once food reached safe cooking temperature, bacterial risk dropped sharply, and slow cooking improved digestibility. Tough cuts of meat, dried beans, barley, and root vegetables all benefited from long, gentle heat. This meant less waste and more calories extracted from every ingredient, which mattered when diets were thin and repetitive. How families actually used the system day after day. A typical routine began early, often before curfews or work shifts. A pot would be brought to a rolling boil for several minutes, long enough to stabilize temperature. The lid was sealed tightly, sometimes with cloth or dough, to prevent heat escape. The pot was then transferred immediately into the insulated box and packed firmly so no air gaps remained. The box was closed and left untouched for 4 to 8 hours. By midday or evening, the food was fully cooked, still hot and safe to eat. One brief fire could produce multiple meals if pots were rotated efficiently. Now, you might wonder why authorities quietly encouraged its use without advertising it. Well, governments did promote fuel conservation quite aggressively, but the haybox cooker, it mostly spread through word of mouth. Official pamphlets were certainly available, yet the tool really thrived because, you see, it could be improvised from household materials, all without attracting any unwanted attention. In occupied regions, this sort of discretion truly mattered. The ability to cook without smoke, or a prolonged fire, or any visible fuel use, well, it reduced the risk of confiscation. Kitchens, as a result, became quieter, colder, and honestly far more efficient. In some regions, entire apartment blocks even coordinated their cooking schedules so that one shared flame could serve many households. So, what can modern readers actually take away from all this without, romanticizing hardship? The retained heat principle is still just as valid today, and honestly, you don't need to feel any nostalgia to see its usefulness. Anyone who's preparing for outages, fuel shortages, or even just living off-grid can put it to work straight away. These days, you can make a modern version using a thick cooler, some tightly packed towels, and a heavy-lidded pot. The important steps haven't changed. Bring your food fully up to temperature, seal it well, insulate it as much as possible, and then just leave it alone. This method is especially handy for things like rice, lentils, beans, oats, soups, and stews. It cuts down fuel use dramatically and keeps your cooking predictable, even when energy supplies are, well, a bit unreliable. You might be wondering, why did this tool outperform modern appliances when things really broke down? Well, modern kitchens are built for abundance, not for scarcity. They're set up with the assumption of constant power, stable supply chains, and, frankly, disposable fuel. The haybox cooker didn't assume any of that. It took whatever brief bit of energy you could get and turned it into long-term nourishment. It worked with whatever ingredients you had on hand, even if they weren't great, and it rewarded patience rather than speed. Most importantly, it shifted cooking from something you had to actively manage to something you could just let happen, which is exactly what survival situations demand. The legacy of the haybox cooker, well, it's kind of hidden in plain sight. A lot of people today use the same principle in slow cookers and thermal pots without even realizing it, but the wartime context really shows why the original design mattered so much. It wasn't about convenience, not really. It was about feeding children through winters when firewood was gone and markets were empty. It was about turning one single flame into a whole day's worth of food. That kind of knowledge isn't obsolete. It's just, a bit unfashionable these days. So, just to bring it all back around, this history still matters for a reason. History is at its most valuable when it shows us what still works after all the comforts are gone. The haybox cooker fed families through one of the most resource-starved periods of the 20th century, and honestly, it can still do the job today if we remember how and why it worked. If you value forgotten survival know-how, practical history, and tools that really prove themselves when systems failed, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who believes resilience is built, not bought.